liberty, which has formed a central role in my own thinking about how to approach questions of cognitive enhancement and neurotechnology. But as the paper I circulated and as some of my comments will indicate, I've drifted away from my strict Millian defense of a libertarian view on cognitive liberty towards a more virtue-oriented, neo-Aristotelian, although as I like to think of it, Buddho-Aristotelian, since I'm more influenced by Buddhism, view of how to structure or think about what the good personality might be, which I think addresses some of John's concerns about the concept of moral enhancement, of which I am an advocate. And along the way, I'd like to talk about some of the ways that neurotechnologies threaten cognitive liberty, and then also how these threats can be addressed by neurotechnologies, and in particular how moral enhancement neurotechnology might address some of these concerns as well. So first, the concept of cognitive liberty, of course, derives first from the claim that the Lockean claim that we control our own body, that we should have the rights of ownership over the contents of our own body, which includes our brain, and that we should be able to control what we put into our body. But it also is a claim founded on the notion that we have a right or a claim to freedom of thought and conscience, because if we do not control the contents of our brain and what kinds of neurochemicals it's using, what kinds of structures it's using, we don't really have freedom of thought or conscience. And so it's both a body claim and a conscience claim. And one of the immediate and most direct applications of this claim of cognitive liberty in current health policy is a claim to the right to certain kinds of psychoactive drugs which don't cause harm to others. So the debate over the decriminalization of psychoactive drugs is a part of this. But increasingly, we have technologies which purport to tell people what we are thinking. So lie detection technologies and brain scanning technologies. And so part of the claim about cognitive liberty is also a right to brain privacy, to have our brain be part of the claim of a general right to privacy. And I think there's a deeper claim as a part of liberal democracy, as a part of the tradition of liberal democratic thought, that we should have the right, that liberal democracy should be supporting individuals in their goal, their seeking of self-realization. And with this I'm reflecting my John Stuart Mill reading, that one of the highest goals of creating a liberal society is that each of us get to explore the many different ways that we might fulfill our own potentials, and cognitive liberty would be a part of that claim. Now, one of the things that's reflected in the paper that I circulated and that I'm increasingly thinking about is how to expand that claim in the direction that Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum have been doing, to say that it's not just a negative claim that people shouldn't be impinging on our rights to freedom, but that also we need enablement in the direction of expanding our freedom and what that might mean in the context of cognitive liberty. So briefly, then about neurotechnologies. By neurotechnologies, I mean not just psychopharmacology, not just genetic engineering, nanotechnology, which I'll talk about briefly, but a broader context of how we can think about our brain. And in this, I'm reflecting the idea of the extended mind thesis, the notion that the brain is not just where thinking happens, that that thinking, cognition, moral sentiments occur in a more general field, which includes the exocortex that we create around ourselves, our computers, our cell phones, our planners, but also our community. The way that we structure the course of our life through the day is a part of the way that we think and the moral structure of our life. And so when we talk about cognitive enhancement, it's not simply about putting a chemical into our brain which allows us to think faster or remember better. It's also about what kinds of devices we surround ourselves with, what kinds of education we subject ourselves to, what kinds of communities we participate in. And these, I think, carry over into how we might think about moral enhancement. And part of this idea is to create a continuity between both the existence of cognitive enhancement in the past and the current kinds of cognitive enhancement that we will be pursuing in the future, And also the policy questions that people pretend or think are novel about neurotechnologies of the future, which are actually continuous with policy questions that have been there in the past. So one claim here is that the first cognitive enhancement that we pursued was when we created literacy, because literacy was effectively the downloading of thought out of our brain onto external media, which we were capable of then reintroducing into our brains, into other people's brains. And so the continuity between doing that and being able to directly neurally record something onto a computer chip in our head and then read it back to ourselves or put it into the cloud and read it back into our brains, there is a direct continuity between the first time someone scrawled on a cave wall and when they put that chip into their head. So if we see that continuity, then these contemporary questions about cognitive enhancement don't seem quite as novel. They're simply continuous with them. The technologies, of course, are developing rapidly, but I'm a sociologist, so I'm making a claim to being a neurologist. If I was a neurologist, I probably would be far more pessimistic about the direction that neurotechnologies might go in, because being a scientist makes you plod at a very slow pace of these things. But if you look at the speed with which deep brain stimulation, for instance, has advanced, so the ability to put wires directly into parts of the brain that control seizures or depression, different kinds of cognitive problems, obsessive compulsive disorder, and then implant these devices so that they monitor brain activity and feed electricity into the parts of the brain. That's one avenue of research. Direct brain-computer interfaces, which just recently have, for instance, not only enabled people to directly, with thought into computer chips, control prosthetic limbs, but also to have tactile feedback from those prosthetic limbs go back into the brain. So one of the problems, of course, is, well, you can have the nerve impulse from the arm go into the arm, but if you can't feel the cup, you might break it with your powerful cyborg arm, but now we've got the prosthetic feedback going back in. Monkeys with these chips in their heads are controlling virtual avatars in virtual spaces with full body sensation feeding back in. So I think that the trajectory that I would like to suggest is one that has been made famous by Ray Kurzweil, who has proposed that within 30, 40, 50 years, we will have very, very small machines which will enable the direct interface with our neural architecture, perhaps billions and trillions of these devices in our brains, and that many different kinds of control and backing up and recording of cognitive processes and interfaces without external media will be enabled by that kind of technology. But as I say, even if we don't get to that point, I think there are lots of policy questions and dimensions of the neurotechnology challenge which are already with us today, but will just become much more explicit and much more enabled by those kinds of future technologies. So what are some of the goals of cognitive enhancement today? Well, one goal is memory enhancement, which may have some moral consequences as well. But of course, there's the attempt to treat dementia and declines of memory, and those may have consequences for enhancing memory as well. There are efforts to control mood, to suppress anxiety, which of course come out of mental health treatment, but may enable us in the future not only to suppress depression or anxiety, but also to have a consistently higher level of day-to-day happiness or day-to-day positive mood. There are efforts to create greater alertness, to suppress sleep, to enable greater speed of learning, productivity, creativity and self-awareness of various kinds through, for instance, psychedelic drugs or transcranial magnetic stimulation. The focusing of magnets on the brain has enabled certain kinds of creative exploration by suppressing self-critical thoughts and so on. Empathy, which is part of the discussion about oxytocin, And MDMA is another drug, ecstasy is another drug that's been implicated in potentially increasing empathetic feelings, sensory enhancement of various kinds, and then finally the enhancement of moral improvement and willpower. So in the context of these wide variety of uses that people are currently putting neurotechnologies to and want to put them to in the future, what are some of the risks to a concept of cognitive liberty that they also pose, and which many people, of course, are concerned about? I will mention here a few. Lack of privacy, the potential for power outages, of course. If your brain's running on electricity, power outages are an enormous danger. That's why we probably want to drive them off of our blood sugar so that we have a more secure power source. Overt control is one of the sources of problems to cognitive technology or cognitive liberty. Problems over intellectual property, which has a double-edged meaning in this context, but the ownership of these technologies is a problem. The coercive effect of social norms is a problem. Addiction is a problem, or the deforming of personality around a particular set of cognitive goals, and inequality. So I'll just briefly mention how these play out. I mentioned that brain privacy is one of the claims of the cognitive liberty movement, and the right to have, for instance, require that the police forces have to get a warrant in order to do any kind of lie detection or any kind of brain sensing. There's been proposals by the Homeland Security Division in the United States that we should have in every airport a brain fingerprinting device that would somehow determine if someone had a terrorist neural structure or a terrorist set of neural responses, and therefore we could pull them out of line and give them the extra frisk. That kind of application, even if it was possible yet, which it isn't, but if it was possible, that kind of application, of course, would raise questions about our right to brain privacy. Overt control, I think, is an extension of issues about freedom of thought, the freedom from indoctrination, from involuntary commitment. And here the greatest problem in liberal democracies will be to distinguish between what's an acceptable range of thought and what is insanity on the one hand, or criminality. So, for instance, one of the problematic cases, I think, is how extreme certain forms of hatred, of violent, offensive beliefs, social beliefs might be before they'd be considered something that should be subject to involuntary mental health treatment. So is someone who has persistently lost jobs because of their neo-Nazi, anti-Semitism, racial, anti-immigrant attitudes, someone who is constantly hurling invective and abuse at their neighbors, should they be subject to some kind of mental health treatment, perhaps given some oxytocin in order to try to overcome those kinds of behaviors, or is that part of the acceptable range of a liberal democracy's tolerance? We just don't have very clear ideas about how that might play out in the future, especially as we begin to introduce neurotechnology correction into the criminal justice system. So as people, for instance, currently we have many countries practice chemical castration for sex offenders. It has been shown, at least by some studies, to reduce recidivism among sex offenders by 90%, to suppress testosterone, chemically castrate them. And that's a form of cognitive and moral enhancement, which I don't think most people have a problem with. But if we start extending that into the suppression of theft impulses or extending that into the suppression of violent impulses for criminals, then we might begin to push people's buttons. So I think, as I said, part of this debate revolves around what is a conception of the good personality, the moral personality towards which we want to shape our concept of personal liberty and our application of neurotechnologies. I'm not an absolute libertarian on these questions because I don't think that we want to devolve into a land of the lotus eaters, a nation of super methamphetamine addicts, people with wires in our brains pushing the rat button over and over again to get the orgasmic pleasure. I don't think that that's the kind of personalities that we want to have one another have. And I think we have a moral responsibility individually and collectively to make sure that the technologies don't go in that direction. I am for the decriminalization of drugs in general, psychoactive drugs, because of the negative consequences of drug criminalization. But I think that in the future there might be such powerful forms of neurotechnological self-effacement or self-degradation that we should, in fact, have a very strong, robust notion of what a flourishing personality is that we can shape public policy toward. And so, in that respect, I've been very interested in how cognitive enhancement might be shaped by a concept of virtue theory and what the virtues might be. And I think this addresses part of what John has been concerned about, which is that virtue theory for a long time has addressed the idea that simply being compassionate in all circumstances is not necessarily a virtue and does not necessarily lead to the good. Simply being courageous in all circumstances doesn't necessarily lead to the good. That any particular virtue has to be entrained and balanced by other virtues in a complex system of moral education, and that they all have to be under the guidance of moral reasoning and our rational faculties, that we have to, under certain circumstances, be ruthless and in others not be ruthless. The evidence that any of you know about the trolley, how many of you know about the trolley experiments? Okay. So we can test some of these moral intuitions that people have by, for instance, asking if a train's going down a track and it's going to hit 5 people, and you have the ability to pull a lever and shunt it off onto another track so that it only hits 1 person, will you pull the lever? And most people say yes, because they intuit that it's better for 1 person to die than for 5, even though they have to kill this 1 person. The second question then is, if you're standing on a bridge over the railroad and you're standing next to a very fat man, and the very fat man, if he fell on the track, would stop the train from killing the 5, would you push the fat man onto the track? And most people say no. And the reason that we find that that's true is because in the first case, you're activating your rational frontal part of your brain, and most people are able to make a utilitarian calculation as long as that's the only part of their brain they're using. In the second calculation, the actual pushing of someone onto the track activates the anterior parts of the brain: fear, anxiety, disgust. And when those disgust reactions get activated, we have different moral sentiments. Now, it turns out that people with specific lesions in those parts of the brain, or psychopaths, have no difficulty with those utilitarian calculations. But I think, as John points out, we go to great effort to train soldiers, to train generals, to train certain kinds of public policy thinkers to make utilitarian calculations, and not to say, well, I'm going to protect my buddy at all costs because we've been here in this trench together forever, and I'm going to sacrifice these 50 men because I don't know them. No, what you want the general to do is to say, I will try to save as many lives as possible, I will try to use as few troops as possible, whatever the utilitarian calculus is. So, in other words, I think there are certain circumstances in which certain moral intuitions that we have to be suppressed. And some of those moral intuitions that John Haidt, for instance, has been identifying are things like respect for the hierarchy of authority, which is an ancient monkey brain intuition that we have, or respect for in-group loyalty over universal moral values, which is an ancient monkey brain intuition that we have. The yuck factor, the sanctity impulse, is another one of these ancient impulses. And liberal democratic philosophy has generally said these are not respectful moral impulses. You know, that in certain circumstances we may think that someone is not someone we want to be friends with if they don't share these impulses. If someone says, oh, I have no problem pushing the man onto the track, you might be a little skittish about having them as a friend, but in fact they might be a moral person in a liberal democratic framework. Now, another part of cognitive enhancement is the potential goal of enhancing the way that we use our reason, our capacity to use reason. And here I've been very influenced by the long ancient work now of Kohlberg on the different levels of moral reasoning, the development of moral reasoning, and it may be dated now and culturally specific, but at least his work suggested that it was possible through increasing cognitive complexity to work one's way up from might equals right kind of moral thinking to a more complex liberal democratic notion of a social contract, and the notion that individuals have a right to violate social norms if they think that they have a higher moral calling and so forth, a general kind of moral reasoning, and that it's developmental in the sense that people with these more complex moral reasoning codes can understand the previous ones, but people with simpler ones can't understand the ones with higher ones, and so that we could actually have this kind of a hierarchy. I think if we think about that kind of moral reasoning, and also the notion of the effort to encode ethical thought or moral codes into software, as is currently being done, for instance, with autonomous robotics, the effort to encode military codes of conduct, the UN, the Geneva Conventions into a military robot so that it doesn't kill civilians, it reduces collateral damage. These kinds of efforts are efforts to say, well, what are our moral codes and how could we possibly put them into a set of rules or sentiments or expert reasoning systems in machines? These will also play back on our own behavior. And I think about very simple examples. There are email systems. If you're afraid in a corporate context that you might send offensive email messages by accident to people in your corporation or your school, there are email systems that you can purchase which allow you to check, to have every message that you sent checked for offensive terms. And it will flag them and say, perhaps this is not a term you want to use because this is perhaps an offensive term. Or a 5-minute delay before the message goes out so you can call it back so you don't do something rashly. Another example might be the sobriety locks on cars of alcoholics, where you have to blow into a tube in order to start your car, or you have to do a number combination in order to show that you're sober enough to drive. So there are ways in which we can encode morality and moral reasoning into the environment, our exocortex around our lives that will help us be more moral people. What kind of time do I have? You put your watch on, John.
I can give that. You're about 20 minutes.
Maybe.
I'm 20 minutes over?
A few minutes, yeah. We may have 5 to 7 minutes.
Okay,
I'm sorry.
great.
Thank you.
Keep pouring water on myself. Okay, so to come in for the close, generally the discussion about moral enhancement has been about enhancing the internal hardware of our brain. And I've tried to suggest that a more general notion of what cognition is, what sentiment is, how it's encoded in the larger structure of our life, and a more general and perhaps optimistic notion about what cognitive enhancement might entail, beyond simply psychopharmaceuticals that we know of today, but future technologies such as neural technologies, may create a broader context for how we might go about moral enhancement, and a context that would protect cognitive liberty, or could protect cognitive liberty against some of the challenges that it will face from neurotechnologies themselves. Let me just give one or two more examples about the threats. One is the threat from the social norms. And here I think very specifically about the possibility of modifying gender identity. Right now, if you think that you have the wrong sexual identity or sexual gender identity for the body that you have, it takes about a year in American medicine to convince a surgeon to do the surgeries necessary to change your gender. If we determine what the neural structures are that underlie our gender identity, it would then be a much simpler choice for people. They would go to the doctor and they say, I think I'm a woman inside a man's body, and they say, well, you can either spend $100,000 to have these set of surgeries and hormone treatments for the rest of your life and not be a very convincing woman, or I can give you this pill which will allow your brain to think that you are a man in a man's body. And I think under those circumstances, there will be many pressures for people to want to do the latter. And the pressure in general to conform to social norms will be very high when we have the control over identity and desire that these kinds of technologies will go. So I worry about that, and I think that neurotechnologies may provide the converse opportunity for us to protect ourselves, to recognize the kinds of social pressures that we're under and to protect ourselves against them. And here we're beginning to identify, for instance, the parts of the brain that respond to and give us actual dopamine rewards for conforming to social norms. So if I came in here today and I found I was the only one wearing a suit, my dopamine would have dropped to very low. If I was able to find a tie and put on a suit, my dopamine would have increased because conforming to social norms is one of the things that monkey brains do. We like to be able to do that. Identifying that, this is one of the reasons why people with Asperger's consider themselves a higher level of the human species, because they don't do that. They don't care what other people think about them. They don't respond to it very well. So I think the degree to which we want to conform to social norms might come under our control. Finally, there is a lot of talk, and one of the papers that I'll be responding to this afternoon addresses the concern about the equality of access to these technologies. This, of course, is an enormous concern. I have often pointed to, again, literacy as an example here. One could have said 100, 200 years ago that people who were literate in any society, they were just going to make more money with their literacy, use that money to hire tutors for their children were going to become more literate. We're going to have eventually two species in our society. One where people were readers, one where people were not readers, and it was going to be eventually developed into the time machine scenario from H.G. Wells with Eloys and Morlocks, and it would be a terrible thing. But people never said that. What they said was, reading is in itself a good. It is a good in itself. And therefore, we should try to expand access to this good to as many people as possible. It is something that we should be demanding equal access to. And so I think if something is in fact an enhancement and not a degradation, we don't demand equal access to heroin addiction. We may have policies that try to make the lives of heroin addicts easier, but we don't demand equal access to it. That's not the claim. We demand equal access to things which are enhancements, which are inherent goods. To the extent that something is in fact an enhancement, we should be in fact including it in the general debate about what should be a part of national health insurance systems. We don't have a national health insurance system in the United States, so I often am talking to blank faces when I talk about this in the States. But here in Europe, you do have universal health care systems, and so the debate here is much simpler. Should it be a part of universal access, or should it not? So, in conclusion, what I'm trying to suggest is that we need to put cognitive liberty at the center of the debate and say, what are the grounds under which we have the right to interfere with people's cognitive liberty? What are the potential threats to people's cognitive liberty? And how will people naturally, and perhaps with some enablement, use neuro technologies to defend their cognitive liberty against those threats? And for me, the largest defense is to have a liberal and democratic society, an egalitarian society. Because without that society, there's no point in having the discussion. If we were having this discussion in North Korea, it would, who cares in North Korea? Well, probably people do care, but the government doesn't care if we say people have a right to cognitive liberty, you shouldn't use these technologies in a certain way. The precondition for caring about this is having the right kind of social structures, social institutions, so that civil society can bring these kinds of concerns up, so that universal access can ensure universal ability to enable. And finally, the need for a positive model of human personality, a flourishing model of personality, which allows us to distinguish between what is in fact enhancement and what is in fact not enhancement or degradation of human personality. Thank you very much.
Thank you.